It's a great, great honor to be here. Thank you. I'm a bit off stage, but that's how it has to be in this day and age. A great honor to be here, a bit nervous. We'll do our best to keep you awake on issues that Aarhus University is world famous for, discussions about the human, posthumans and derivatives. Great to see so many friendly faces, old friends in the audience, from Nina Likos, part of my extended family, to Robin May, whom I haven't seen forever, to Anna Tsing, whom I love and adore and admire from afar. Thank you for being here. 40 minutes to keep you awake. It's going to be quite a rush in some ways. I want to summarize quickly my take on the posthuman and then take you on what's happening to the humanities, what's happening to us. As a student of Foucault, what's happening to us, what kind of subjects are we in the process of becoming is the question. It's a question that has led me through so many of my intellectual itineraries, assuming the tracking, the developments of power and knowledge, power as knowledge, is the work of critical theory. Monuments and documents, what texts are being produced, what institutions are being created, how do we fit in with this, what margins of negotiation do we have? I am absolutely a French, I'm a Sorbonne PhD, I'm a French educated person. I belong to the materialist branch of the post-structuralist family, that's like blah, 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 but it simply means that we're looking at material foundations. The points of reference would be, and then we'll come back in the talk a bit, Spinoza, feminist epistemologies, grounded perspectives. And I can't go too much into the methodology, but I will make a few points in passing and hope that we can come back to it in the discussion, because questions of methods are incredibly important in the discussion about human, panhumans, transhuman, all the humans. I'm assuming a number of starting points which you may or may not agree with, so I am putting them out there as a starter. The humanities are not well placed to talk about the human. We can talk about man in all of his configurations, and when we do, we define man usually as the man of reason. I'm a philosopher, and we define man in relation to what he is not. He's not an animal. If he's an animal, he's a thinking animal. He's not a woman, and if he's a woman, he's sort of within not so porous boundaries. And he is intrinsically Western and European, intrinsically. And culture and civilizational discourses permeate our understanding of men. As humanities scholars, we've been more than happy to delegate the human to biologists and to that strange tribe of fascinating scholars that are the anthropologists. Anthropology is the winner in here. The anthropology takes it all. It's extraordinary. There will be a whole discussion here, and I'll delegate that also to the questions. So Dante, not Darwin, is how we approach the question of men. And part of the problem of the era that we're going through is that we cannot avoid the issue of the human, as Andreas quite rightly put it. It's forcing itself upon us. Are we up to the task of actually debating it, picking it up? Second assumption, the human is not neutral. The term human is anything but neutral. In my perspective, here comes my feminism, my anti-racism, my anti-fascism. The human is a term that actually indexes access to rights, to entitlement, to visibility, to credibility. Entire categories of inhabitants of this earth never qualified as human, had to struggle to qualify as human. Not so long ago, Catherine McKinnon, the great feminist lawyer, wrote a book called Are Women Human? Well, if you're going to look at the history of philosophy, you will have a pretty hard time figuring out at what particular point we emerge from the category of animality. Are non-whites, non-European, people of color, Africans human? Remember Linnaeus' classification of races? Where does the animal begin? It begins at the Africans. That's Linnaeus' classification of species. It's so racialized, so sexualized, and so genderized that the human has to be taken with a great deal of care and be situated very carefully. Which human, where, how, in which context. In order to reassure the more, what shall I call, more grounded, more empirical members of our community, when I say the human does not have a single univocal meaning, we need to situate it, I am not pleading for relativism. I am pleading for a different epistemology, which is politics of location, if you are from the radical epistemology, immanence, if you are with the Foucauldian Deleuzian machinery, perspectivism, if you are with Vivero de Castro and the new, more indigenous-oriented epistemologies, Descola, the people who are actually looking at grounded perspectives. Things look very differently depending which ontological windows you pertain to. Leibniz belongs to this conversation, and we have in our historical tradition in philosophy multiple philosophy of perspectives, not relativism, grounded perspectives, a world apart. I am not a relativist. I'm a grounded perspectival type of thinker. Okay, these are the assumptions. We can probably stop and start the discussion already on these, as it is already an approach that then frames the question of the posthuman. The question is a convergence. It is a convergence between posthumanism and post-anthropocentrism. A convergence across the spectrum of cognitive capitalism. I'll go quickly through that in a minute. I want to stress the convergence part, because if you look at the state of the scholarship, there is a tendency at the moment to resegregate the knowledge. There is an entire industry doing Anthropocene. It's a full-time job. The Anthropocene has gone ballistic. I would say in the stock market of ideas, my money is on the Anthropocene. Oh man, it's all over the place. Nobody knows what it means. I'll tell you in a minute, but extraordinary. But also identity-driven claims, so that you get a resegregation, refragmentation, critiques of humanism on the one hand, critiques of anthropocentrism on the other. My point is that the posthuman convergence is forcing these two lines of critique upon us, not just the man of the Vitruvian Enlightenment tradition, and not just anthropos. It is both of them that are staring us in the face. And this convergence is due to the historicity, to the context that we are living in, to the enormous developments of our science and technology, the incredible upheavals that they cause, not only in the order of production of knowledge, but also in our economy. People call it the fourth industrial revolution, at the same time as the great Anthropocene climate change crisis, which people call the sixth extinction. At the same time, the fourth industrial revolution and the sixth extinction. It's not as if we can do one on Monday and the other one on Tuesday. They are happening simultaneously. And that convergence is what interests me, and how they come together and what happens when they dislocate long ancient habits of thought about man, the human, and all relevant categories. So we need a qualitative leap in new conceptual directions. And I love qualitative leaps because all of my life I've been wanting to try to think differently and to move away from established patterns of thought. It's part of the baby boomers program to review knowledge production. It's part also of a gesture of generosity towards our culture that needs to keep up with itself in some respects. At the heart of this kind of convergence, obviously these technologies, them machines, the machines that are going to be suppressing 66 million jobs in the next 20 years, according to OECD. Can we develop a relationship to them that would be of an order that we could recognize as ethical, even caring in some respects? How intimate are we with these techno others, and how fluent are we in understanding the complex labor relations that go in the unmaking and making and unmaking of these technologies? They look so clean and proper and ethereal, but what about the heavy labor, the minerals, the mines, and the child labor, the dismantling of dead computers? A lot of really interesting materialist scholarship on dead technologies. It's a whole machinery, and Apple, it's very difficult to get a good photo of Apple computers as a garbage heap. The only garbage photos you get are organic garbage. Inorganic garbage photos are strictly policed, because of course Apple has to keep up its image as clean. It's dirty, it's toxic, it's mines, it's child laborers, it's geopolitics, it's war, it's all of that. Let's call it our laptops, but they contain a real geology and geopolitics of labor relations. So I want to try to think of the Convergence in these terms: posthumanism, post-anthropocentrism, the coming of an intimate relationship with these machines in a world where the economy is so polarized that we are getting really brutal, primitive labor relations. To call this the Anthropocene is not enough. To reduce it to a climate change crisis is not enough. We have to keep a much broader picture. We need to bring the socio-economic, the labor relations in from the start, because if we don't do that, the Anthropocene is beginning to look like a fit of white middle-age panic, that the sky is falling and our species is in danger of becoming extinct. And if you read race theory, decolonial scholarship, indigenous scholars, they are really giving it to us straight, saying, oh, come, so now you're getting worried about extinction. Can you talk to me for a while? My people who have inherited colonialism, the looting, the savage devastation, we are the engineers of survival. You want to talk about climate change? Talk to me. And I think these conversations are extremely important and very painful and very difficult at the moment in critical theory. And again, radical epistemologies like feminism and anti-racism are out there trying to build bridges, and not enough to just take the Anthropocene. Besides, the Anthropocene is an anthropomeme. It has gone into a spin. It has generated a whole set of spin-offs. Look at the dates, all very recent scholarship. There is Anna with her pioneering work, and it continues. I think one of the traits of contemporary knowledge production is these speeds, these accelerations. The concepts really go berserk. They go into a spin, and the Anthropocene has gone. Even as we speak, you will see, but I will show you some other slides in other areas of knowledge where the same accelerationism is at work. And we've just put out a special issue of Theory, Culture and Society with Matthew Fuller on epistemic accelerationism, capitalism as schizophrenia, speeds. You take a concept, it goes into a spin, lost, whatever the Anthropocene may have meant, by now it has entered a different sphere of commodity circulation. It has become a discursive commodity in that respect. So how we perceive the questions now of the convergence, posthumanism, post-anthropocentrism, how we perceive that is very much a matter of affect, of fantasy, of almost psychological impact. And there is no question that there is an entire cultural industry that is implementing a general sort of melancholia about the future. The imaginary of disaster is how advanced capitalism is presenting to us the posthuman challenge. I mean, we spend our life sort of looking at these products, one after the other. It's true, they're all the same, and they're all white pots, heavily idealized. The late Blade Runner will be an example. It's about a father-daughter relationship at the end of the day. Really interesting. Bored. So extremely conservative, but implementing this question of enormous anxiety about the future. Be very careful with this social machinery of the imaginary of disaster, because it is really confusing the issues and making a lot of money out of our anxieties. Serious scholars are also into fits of anxiety. Fukuyama, very conservative, a while back, calls for soft eugenics. Extraordinary guy, Fukuyama. Look out for him. He never shuts up. always come out with most extraordinary contradictions. And in this one, he's extremely worried. If you look at the cover of his book, it is something like 20 faces of white babies. And I didn't want to, I felt embarrassed, so I didn't want to copy it. But go and have a look at it. It's clear where the anxiety is. Habermas, a social democrat, a very dignified person, worried that technology is destroying something that he calls human nature. Somebody better define that one to me. I am not enamored of human nature. What has human nature ever done for women, natives, and LGBT and others? Sloterdijk, another one, fit of anxiety, neo-Heideggerian. One of his students is a leader of Alternative für Deutschland, by the way, I just discovered. Sloterdijk better sort of look closer at home than the human zoo. His Holiness, the Pope, extraordinary figure, one of the great environmentalists. I'm not religious, but when the Pope had his seminars at Castel Gandolfo a few years ago on the Anthropocene, he got to invite his own keynote speakers as opposed to the multitudes of cardinals with their Aristotelian framework. And you probably do know who the speaker was that the Pope had invited. Who else would he invite? Naomi Klein, of course. Who else do you invite? Sort of left-wing, radical, and feminist critic of capitalism. How that man is still alive is something that in Italy we do wonder about. Steve Bannon has a coalition of very conservative cardinals that want him removed. Bannon has offices in Italy, is actively working to have him removed through the charges of pedophilia and the inactivity of the church on the pedophilia issue, is going for the killing because that Pope is much too radical for the populist fascists that are running the show these days. So a whole machinery of anxiety, discursive anxiety and imaginary anxiety, which I would fight with heavy doses of Spinozist affirmative ethics, ethics of joy. And I hope we have enough time to talk about this, although it wasn't really the core of today's lecture. Quickly, in this context, I mentioned rapidly before that the spectrum, the context of this is cognitive capitalism. It's still good old capitalism selling us commodities. Commodities which are quantitative proliferations of objects that we don't need. It's quantitative proliferation, multiples of one. It's the same thing multiplied over 100, different colors, different things, but it's basically multiples of one. And for us, people of ideas, the essential commodities is technology. For the millennials in the audience, if you think I don't wear brands, I am above capitalism, can I look at the brand of your iPhone, please? Of your laptops, of your iPad? I think essentially for the younger one, it's the technology. And the essential commodity is those tablets that cost a fortune and have planned obsolescence so that they die after 2 years, so that you are perennially renewing them because that's how they've been designed. So enter this conversation through the real commodity for you today, which is the technology. You don't have to wear Prada. You just use Apple. Apple is worth $1 trillion. This hadn't happened since the first industrial revolution. Amazon and Apples are through the $1 trillion threshold. That's extraordinary. It's the sort of stuff that Charles Dickens reported in the first industrial revolution, the monopoly, the absolute concentration of resources. So think in those terms and you can enter the discussion about commodities. What do commodities do? They sell you a sense of identity. They make you feel like you are the one and only. They sell you a sense of subjective identity, extraordinary way. We shop to confirm our identity. We shop to confirm that we exist. And each one feels very unique because we've just bought a multiple of one. Quantitative proliferations, but they sell you uniqueness. In my book, I talk about the Vitruvian man gone Starbucks. I despise Starbucks. As an Italian, the only coffee to drink is ours. This rubbish has to go. But the Vitruvian man on a Starbucks cup is almost, in my sense, the assessment of what the great Enlightenment ideals have come to, that it should have come to this. Now, in this context of cognitive capitalism, what has happened is that the capital that matters is knowledge about life. Knowledge about living systems. And we can date this, according to Evelyn Fox Keller, it really happens with the rise of microbiology and the new biology, which actually is connected to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the first open-air analysis of genetic mutation as a result of the falling of the nuclear bomb. There's a whole interesting story there that needs to be looked at. But basically, our understanding of the codes of life. And they are biogenetic codes. You're looking at genetically modified tomatoes and artificial synthetic biology meat, artificial meat, which was made in, among other places, Maastricht a few years back. The first synthetic hamburger cost $250,000. Today it's down to $17. It's got all the proteins. We just can't taste it because our brains are not wired, but just you wait. So codes of life, biogenetic, and of course informational. It's understanding the codes of living system in order to replicate them and capitalize on them that makes capitalism cognitive. It's not just the fact that knowledge is power. My dear Michel Foucault, whom I love and respect, knowledge is money. And this is new. The extent of the capitalization on living system is new. It puts the universities in a really difficult position because we are primary agents of cognitive capitalism. We produce a great deal of the methodologies, the basic fundamental tools that then get applied to the making of the wonderful complex system that we're in. Here they are. Our system has its every dose of not only politics of life, but politics of death, and the necropolitical and the biopolitical work hand in hand. Our war machine is not human. Drones are flown from miles away, thousands of miles away, by young gamers who, you know, they don't even know if they understand the consequences of their actions. I hope for them that they do in a good Kantian manner. But because the education and the training of drones pilots is private, we have no ways of assessing what their status is and how they come out of this fanatical wars, killing long distance. We don't even have the data for that. But a very strong removal, in a sense, of immediate human agency from the way we fight. The inhuman is all over the posthuman convergence. We call them refugees, 60 million of people moving around the world, escaping from different kinds of disaster. To reduce them to the problem of migration is adding insult to injury, is an undignified, absolute shortcut through a set of complex issues for which the West has many responsibilities and questions to answer. It's the single most important issue on our plate today, to actually understand the extent to which the forced mobility of millions of our fellow planetary citizens is an issue that we are all responsible for, and notice to what an extent populist movements exploit it as the fodder for their own xenophobic and scapegoating, ridiculous, homicidal projects, if I can just put it lightly. A sketch. For each of these, I could talk for hours about the literature on synthetic biology and the coming of the cyborgian Vitruvian, what the implications are of genetic modification. What is the fundamental implication of the fact that today we don't have to exploit nature, we can just remake it. We can rewild, we can de-extinct. The speed, the acceleration of that. As a woman of science, I just want to open a bottle of Prosecco, very good excuse, isn't it? To celebrate the incredible leap forwards of our science and technology. What amazing times to be living through, that we should be capable of this. But we're also capable of this. And we're also capable of this. And we cannot just select one half of this picture and say, ooh, we're all becoming posthuman. Just a moment. Who is the we? Who is becoming what, and what does it mean? It's a 1,000 plateaus of becoming, much more complex than the futuristic scenarios on the one hand and the apocalyptic lament on the other. Between the futuristic scenarios and the apocalyptic lament, somewhere in the middle, another milieu, a middle way of becoming posthuman by actually talking together about what we're capable of becoming. That's the conclusion. I can now really stop. to give you a sense of why this is not a crisis and why I am absolutely enthusiastic about this, I use my empirical evidence, which is the scholarship, the discourses that are being produced. The posthuman is not a crisis at all. It is an open question that has produced an enormous field of knowledge. And if you look at simply the number of monographs, I can distribute this slide, it's not a very big issue, and here Aarhus has played a very, very important role. We have the first posthuman manifestos from 2003, that's like 15 years ago. Just read them. Here's Raffenso. This is as my own selection of the amount of work being produced under the cover of the posthuman convergence. It means that there are different forms of posthumanism, insurgent, speculative, liberal in some ways. It's again, look at the dates we're talking about yesterday. Cultural, literary, ahumanism, all of those. The term posthumanities, the paternity goes to Carrie Wolf, who did it a few years ago already. Enormous proliferation. If this were a terminal crisis, signifying the end of the West and the end of humanity, it wouldn't be so generative and so creative. This is no crisis at all. It's a huge leap towards more complex understandings of what it means to be human after European humanism with all of its limitations and after anthropocentrism with all of its limitations. A new story beginning, opening up new perspective. This differentiation of the posthumanism will become very important when we sort of look at the accelerations in the knowledge production. So bear with me till I sort of depict the whole picture and then we draw the conclusion together. In this epistemic acceleration, some are faster than others. And the feminist theorists and the queer and posthuman have moved very, very fast in grabbing possibility of this empathic bonds between women, non-human, including monstrous and alien others. There is a long tradition, Afrofuturism is part of this tradition, of really grabbing the possibility of going beyond the human in order to escape oppression. And in feminist science fiction, or in black science fiction, Octavia Butler would be an example, you get this alliance between women, animals, Africans, extraterrestrials, anything to escape the empire of white men. And I think there's a lot of this going on at the moment in the popular culture, in queer and transhuman studies, very interesting genealogies where you get a disidentification from dominant forms of the human, disidentification which are not a kind of indifference, they are just disidentification, they're critical distancing from the norm in order to explore its limitations as well as its great potential. So much going on that we've just put out a posthuman glossary. It's gotten something like 107 entry, 93 contributors, short pieces. I think we have flyers out there. I'm looking at Sinye. We've put out flyers. We have a straight posthuman glossary where you can look at the different meanings of posthumanism. There are 3-4 entries for inhuman. There are several transhumanisms. And then we also have, together with Cecilia Asberg, the Feminist Companions to the Posthumanities. And we have that flyer out there as well. We put them out at the same time as evidence that this is not a terminal crisis. It's an incredible moment. This is just rather messy, as my friend Anad Singh will say. It's not straightforward, but it is exciting. It's vital. It's something that should make us believe in the future. Trust where we are going with this. Institutions are accelerating. Oxford, of course, would they miss this one? The Future of Humanity Institute, Nick Bostrom, the transhumanists, I would say they are the great leaders of this particular posthuman convergence. And Oxford has invested millions into an institute that is working on human enhancement, accelerating our brains so that they can move as fast as the computational networks that we've created. Because guess what? Machines think faster than we do, just a matter of seconds, but enough to delay our responses. Human enhancement, the project is called Superintelligence. I'm not talking about science fiction. It's the Oxford Institute for the Future of Humanity. Nick Bostrom got the ERC grant a few years ago. Absolute institutional posthumanism. Oxford and Cambridge, aren't they cute? They're always doing this. So Cambridge sets up the Institute for the Analysis of Existential Risk to analyze the risk of what Oxford is doing with human enhancement. I mean, they've got to keep busy, right? But of course, these are massive scientific enterprises. We are talking about scientists here that are of the highest quality with massive multi-million euro investments. So you budding posthumanists out there, you go on that website and get yourself jobs. They're hiring massively with the money that they have. But the formula is analytic posthumanism, normative neo-humanism. Nick Bostrom is a neo-Kantian humanist. He believes the human enhancement, including inserting microchips in your brains and various forms of neural enhancement, are totally compatible with the project of the Enlightenment. In fact, they are the fulfillment of the project of the Enlightenment, which, may I remind you, was the perfectibility of the humans, of men, through the application of scientific reason. So Bostrom gives you, in my opinion, the winning formula of cognitive capitalism. Analytically posthuman, normatively neo-humanist. Brilliant. A catastrophe. Because you are getting, in terms of the norms and values, a return of the most restrictive and the most flawed system of values, absolutely dismissing the critiques of humanism that for the last 30 years have been brought forth by all the radical movements, decolonial movements, post-colonial movements, dismissing all of that in the name of something that we call the triumph of humanity, the perfectibility of the humanity. What is the human in that humanity? But if you raise the question, you run the risk of being perceived as somebody who's anti-science. But it's the human. We all know what the human is. Actually, I don't know what the human is. It's not a neutral term. Remember my introduction? It's a very diversified term. It depends where you're entering this conversation. If you want your grant, that's what you do. Analytic posthumanism, normative neo-humanism. If you are honest to yourself, do a Rosi, demand a new ethics that goes with the complexity of the times. It may not get you the grant, but it will keep you clever. It will keep you going. Linköping, bless their soul, they've been at it forever. The radical wing looking at post-humanities in their complexity as hybrid assemblages of transversal discourses addressing the issues, speaking truth to these new configurations of power. The Germans spent first 60 million euros for the first phase called the Anthropocene, and now another 50 million on a new phase called the Technosphere. And they queued 110 million they spent over the last, I think, 80 years on this massive project exploring different facets of the posthuman convergence. Worth looking at their website, worth talking to them, worth going to your government and say, if Germany spends 110, you can spend 5, so that we can have fundamental humanities labs to ask the question, what is the human in the new humanities? What are we becoming? What is happening to us? And the Germans here are an absolute model. Canada, Brock University, Posthuman Research Institute, NYU, Posthuman Research Group, Australia, New England, journals. Of course, both the posthuman studies and transhumanities coming out of Korea with editorial boards, of course, across the world, and the critical posthumanist network of our friends in Switzerland. Very advanced process of institutionalization. This is not a piece of relativistic frenzy. It's a serious movement, very well implanted and moving very fast in the canonization of knowledge. Okay. How are we to assess what is happening? Where do we start trying to put a little bit of order in what looks like a if you want to be optimistic, pathologically optimistic like me, a qualitative leap, bit more cautious, an epistemic acceleration, something speeding up around the human. How do we discuss this? One of the issues that was brought up already by Andreas is that there is a paradox at the core of this. The paradox that all of this proliferation of discourses about men, the human, are happening on the brink of extinction, because we have an Anthropocene problem. It's at the moment of its evanescence that the category becomes thinkable. And here, how can I not think of Michel Foucault's image of the face of man on the sand by the seaside, in The Order of Things, 1966, Les Mots et les Choses. The face of man drawn on the sand, and the wave of history comes and just erases it. Because man is a recent construction, an 18th century construct that has reached the end of its historical function. It's not a recipe for extinction, it's a recipe for a renewal, or it's a recipe for both. So I want us to think of the present, and here Deleuze is coming in, but that's another lecture, but this is the Bergsonian head of Deleuze coming in. The present is not just the actual. It's not a flat here and now. It is both the record of what we are ceasing to be, the actual, we're ceasing to be men, I hope, and it is also the seeds of what we're in the process of becoming, the virtual, at the same time. It's multi-directional. There's no such a thing as the present. It's looking in several directions at once. It contains within it the seeds of its own transformation, the seeds of its own overcoming. So that there is no real paradox in the simultaneous overexposure and disappearance of the category of the human. It cannot be any other way. Categories become thinkable when they lose the self-evidence that comes from being dominant. Dominant categories are never transparent because they're dominant, they're operational. It's the moment that they actually cease to be so that they become thinkable. It shows the dynamic, nomadic, fluid nature of time. I don't want to go too much into this because it keeps us from the drinks. But I would like to resolve this paradox that Chakrabarty and a lot of the Derridians, Colebrook, seem to be getting into. Oh, we are thinking about a category that is disappearing. Well, when else would you think about a category except when it opens up, because it is in the process of moving. It is not an extinction. It's not a Heideggerian horizons of mortality. It's the becoming process. It's the opening up of virtuality. How much time have I got?
8 minutes.
8 minutes. I thought, I'm so glad I asked. Okay, so now I really have to accelerate. I propose that on the basis of this, looking at the present as actual, but also as virtual, that we look at a number of building blocks. I would like to give you, if you know some of my work, you know this, so I can go quickly, how I would narrate a number of shifts that produce a very affirmative leap towards the new humanities. You will not be surprised. It begins when the disciplines lose the hold of knowledge production. And we can discuss whether that is in 1820 or in 1968, but certainly in the last 30 years, the motor of change in many of disciplines in the humanities has been this hybrid configurations of discourses that happen around, beneath, below, between the disciplines. And these areas of studies call themselves studies. The lists are completely open. They come from my own limited sense, but studies. And I collect studies, so please do me a favor. If you find a new study, throw it at me. In the first generation, it's basically the critique of humanism. You really get the critique of the man of reason. It's the critique of the sexualization, racialization, naturalization of differences. Gender, feminist, queer, race. Cultural studies is the critique of the holy canon, of the holy texts of Western culture. I remember not only film studies, I remember theater studies. So anybody old enough to remember theater studies? Remember that? Woo! Extraordinary. Became film and television studies, and then media studies. We will see in a minute what happens to media studies in the present configuration. Performance studies is already a variation on this. So there is a critique essentially of humanism. There is a great love for the world. The first generation of studies want to bring the 20th century into the university. I remember my colleague at the University of Bologna refusing to do film studies because there is no muse for cinema. I swear to God. Aren't they cute? So they put it as next to the university, the Dams. It's one of the great institutes, but it's not part of the oldest university in Europe because, hey, there's no muse for cinema. I thought it was a joke. They meant it. These are disciplines that are in the world, studies wanting to be part of the world, in love with the present, as we all remain generational. And they are speaking truth to power as a matter of fact. So subaltern studies, race and post-colonial studies, they talk about discourse and power, and making themselves very, very unwelcome, being accused of all sorts of things, from being rude to being, of course, relativistic, which is always the buzzword for being unscientific. Big discussion there. If you look at the proliferation of discourses in each of these, we would need 6 hours. So, first generation studies, second generation studies, I would date them from the end of cultural studies, so end of the 80s. Anthropocentrism gets targeted a lot more. At the moment, critical plant studies is my favorite. But I've seen recently another variation on this. Check out what's happening just with inhuman, posthuman, non-human, and the new generation of studies. Of course, some are classical, cultural studies of science and technology, but FET studies, success studies, globalization studies, of course, death studies. Nina Lick is a pioneer of that, and is part of this part. I'll come back to this. Look what happens to media studies. First of all, it becomes new media studies, just as a starter. That breaks down game, internet, software, critical, post-Snowden studies. Don't you love it? All of this, I wish I'd made it up. I didn't. It's all in the field. Acceleration, speeds, it keeps on going. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's not relativism, it's acceleration. It's moving very, very fast. And you will see the latest mutation of this, and then we can assess together what is happening. Of course, these new studies take non-human object of studies. They take code, plants, animals, but my argument is that there's not just a new object of study, there's something else going on in the methodologies and in the conceptual framework of this. The inhuman is absolutely up there. Conflict and peace studies. I just met somebody here that was in peace studies, and that's post-Cold War knowledge, peace studies. Human rights, humanitarian studies, trauma and memory studies. I mean, memory studies is like a factory. It's like a planet. Culture, memory, and trauma is what we used to call cultural studies in the 80s. It's huge, enormously important. That's studies which immediately broke down into suicide studies, and so on and so forth. So first generation studies, second generation studies, following on from each other, but also not. Changes of object of studies, speeds and accelerations. And then at some particular point in the last 8 to 10 years, the discourse changes. And all of a sudden, we don't have so many studies, although they continue. We have claims to alternative humanities. At what particular point did animal studies become environmental humanities? Anthropocene humanities, ecological humanities? At what particular point did climate studies or earth sciences become sustainable humanities? At what particular point public humanities or area studies became the greater humanities? Or the medical humanities, the biohumanities, evolutionary humanities? I'm not making this up, I wish I was. This is happening under our very eyes. Look at the dates of the publications. Look at what is happening to the concept of the humanities. Post-humanities, 2010. Inhuman humanities, Liz, 11. The grandmother, digital humanities, Catherine Hales, already it's 1999, it's not 90, it's 1999. Transformative, critical, misspelled, nomadic humanities, that Catherine Stimpson should have thought of that and not I, is really annoying, but I didn't think of it. She wrote a couple of years ago. Adjectival humanities, as our friend puts it in his work, I think it comes from Leuven. So what happens in the leap from a proliferation of media studies, even something like new media study, that is caught in a spin? At what particular point does new media studies become the digital humanities? And what is involved in that shift? Because these shifts and changes are institutionals. It means that new centers go up, new departments all of a sudden appear. And at least in my experience of the ones, I didn't get the big ERC grant that I wanted to research this on. Surprise. So the only empirical evidence I can get is in grabbing what I can. But in Utrecht, even at Harvard, environmental humanities was created overnight as an external entity with a couple of historians, the usual resident, forgive me, Robin, but Kantian philosopher that does ethics, and the rest engineers, corporate money, and people that have nothing to do with the humanities at all. Digital humanities, same story. Code, corporate, robotics, but they've taken the humanities. That term has entered a spin from which we really need to either rescue it or intervene massively to actually ask a few questions about what is happening. I would say that the critical posthumanity, as I call them in my attempt to have a conversation with them, assume a broader subject of knowledge, more complex, and a collaborative web of human and non-human agents. It's a step forward. Here comes my affirmative sort of notion. I have to skip a whole section here because I'm way out of time. Okay, so we'll go to the conclusion. If we agree to a set of acceleration around the explosion of the human or around the posthuman convergence as a conversion of posthumanism, post-anthropocentrism, operationalized in generation of critical studies, which in the current neoliberal governance of the university get re-territorialized, I'm using the language of Deleuze, into the new humanities. Because these new disciplines call themselves digital humanities, they call themselves new media studies, they call themselves environmental humanities, they call themselves medical humanities, and they get the research money that is due to the humanities. Now, how many of us are trying to get money for research in the humanities? Well, keep trying. The money is in these other institutions that call themselves the humanities, although they're not, or they are in a new conversation. So what I would like to do is intervene in this configuration of power that is my world, the university that I love, respect, admire, contribute to, and say to them, well, there are some people missing here. There are missing people. The missing people are missing because they are empirically missing. It's always the same, the usual suspects that are never taken in. They are the sexualized, racialized, ecologized, or naturalized others. They are not making it into the new humanities. I haven't seen non-nationally indexed institutes of humanities. I see massive renationalization of humanities, left, right, and center. I haven't seen feminist queer humanities institutes. There's no evidence of it in the field. Black humanities, keep trying. Migrant diasporic humanities, poor trailer park humanities. I owe this to Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty has this in his beautiful text, Achieving Our Country, where, by the way, if you need a good stiff GNT, but read Richard Rorty's Achieving Our Country, 1990-something, 1993, 4, when he talks about why the university is failing it's working class, and he says, you're all up there with your cultural studies, your deconstruction. Can't you see that the working class is missing out on the fourth industrial revolution? If you leave them alone, the poor trailer park people will go running for a strong man that will solve their problem. They will absolutely look for a solution in a strong man. The future of America is fascism. Richard wrote it, 1990. Read it. G&T afterwards. I haven't seen much decolonial humanities. I haven't seen much of a child's humanities, a lot of stuff on children, but not these claims that you can reconstitute the human from the axis of otherness. There is no evidence of this in the field, in the scholarship, or in the reality. So what I would like to propose is planetary differential posthumanities, indigenous, environmental and digital humanities, postcolonial Greens, decolonial futures, transnationals, queer neo-humanism, indigenous knowledges, and so on and so forth. Bring in the missing people. Bring in the missing links. Resist the temptation to go into futuristic kind of delirium or apocalyptic lament. Find a middle ground. Ground these new humanities in the real world with its complexity, with its differences. Multiple way of becoming posthuman. Multiple planetary differential ways of becoming posthuman subjects of knowledge, reflecting our own differences, not in a relativistic manner, but in a perspectival one. It is the only world we have. It is the best that we could do. You may not say it is much, but when you look at the production of knowledge, it's extraordinary. What amazing time. Let's now make them work in the right direction. Let's demand that the missing people be brought back in for the sake of justice, for love of the world, for the hell of it. Thank you.